Good afternoon, it's Mark Mandelbaum. I'm chairman of Lanterra Development, and I am very proud to introduce to you another of our Lanterra webinar series. This is the first one for 2021. We've just finished probably one of the most dramatic years we've ever had, and we're now looking forward to 2021. I have with me today, very honored, probably one of the most prestigious panels we've ever had, the Honorable Michelle Rempel Gardner, who is the MP from Nose Hill in Calgary. She is the Shadow Minister of Health, or the Minister of Health in the Shadow Cabinet. We used to call that the health critic, but I guess that's the official version right now. And we have with us as well a close friend and somebody I admire more than anybody else in the business world, particularly in real estate, John Love, who heads KingSett, which is the largest private equity real estate investment company in Canada. So welcome, everybody. We have a lot to talk about, and it's great having you here to share some very, very important issues. So we are going to be having a format of about an hour. But first 45, 50 minutes, we will have a discussion about the very important issues of the day, which will include the public health issues relating to Canada, which Michelle hopefully will be enlightening us on, economic issues that affect us now and looking forward into 2021, and of course, how the political landscape, both here and in the United States, are going to be affecting us over the next year. So having said that, Michelle, you were once in my house in Bedford for a fundraiser. We were all very impressed and really appreciate you being with us today.
Yeah, thanks so much, Mark, for having me. I think that in the context of people who might be listening today, the theme that I would put some of the health issues on that we'll have a discussion about is when can we get to a place of certainty in terms of understanding some of the public health interventions that could bring us out of these repetitive lockdowns. And I'm happy to give a bit of an update on that and answer any questions that your listeners might have.
That's great. And John, again, you were also on one of my events at Bedford. It was an honor having you. And for my audience, or our audience here today, both Michelle and John have a very, very strong social media presence. I follow both of them avidly. That's one of the reasons I tried to put you both together. Both in their own rights, they are probably one of the smartest and most insightful commentators on the issues that we'll be talking about today. So let's start with public health issues. And I know, Michelle, you do a lot of talking about that recently. The question on everybody's mind, first and foremost, is obviously, when is somebody going to stick a needle in my arm? How come Canada is not getting a lot of vaccines? How come it's so difficult? How come I hear other jurisdictions like Miami, Israel probably vaccinated 20% of their population? What's going on? And generally, there are different public health jurisdictions in Canada, provincially and federally. And how do you think they've been handling it? What have we learned? Have we been using our resources wisely? And what should we do to prepare ourselves for the future?
Sure, thanks, Mark. I'll just preface all of my comments by saying I think that this issue transcends politics, and I take no joy in highlighting some of the deficiencies that I think the federal government needs to answer for very quickly. The federal government needs to succeed in this regard in order for our country to move forward. So, I see my role in the official opposition is to push the government for transparency and clarity on some of these issues so that we can move forward. So I guess I would I would lump my response into sort of three areas. One is vaccine procurement and delivery. The second is rapid testing. And then the third is sort of emerging issues that would prevent or haven't really been factored into the responses to 1 and 2, for example, emergent variants of COVID. So, with regard to vaccine procurement, it's not just me saying this. Canadian journalists from every outlet are having a very difficult time understanding what assumptions the government has made in terms of vaccine delivery, like when we're actually getting it. The government's talking point to date has been we have procured the most doses, we have the biggest portfolio of vaccines in the world. But as many commentators and public health officials have made across the country in recent weeks, that doesn't really do us any good if we don't know when we're getting them or if we're not getting them soon. And provincial governments of all political stripe have also been making this point. For example, here in Alberta today, the provincial government is saying it's got the capacity to issue or deliver tens of thousands of doses, but they're just not getting it. And what the information that we don't have from the federal government is twofold in this regard. First of all, when are we getting, and on with what volume are we getting more doses of the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, which are the two vaccines that have been approved in Canada to date, but also have very problematic specialized storage and delivery requirements. So they have to be stored at a very low temperature. I think many people are familiar with this. I think what the government is banking on with regard to saying that we might be in a position for the general public to have access to the vaccine in fall of this year, is that vaccines like the AstraZeneca vaccine is approved by Health Canada within a timely period, let's say Q1, Q2 of this year. AstraZeneca is a different technological platform than the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, but it also can be delivered in kind of the same format that a flu shot would be. It doesn't need these frozen temperatures. We don't know, the public doesn't know how much the government is banking on the AstraZeneca vaccine. So if the AstraZeneca vaccine either isn't approved, and there have been problems with it, it was bumped back in its clinical trials, I think a couple of months ago. It has been approved by a couple of countries around the world, but not widely. If we're banking only on that, and there's a delay in that approval, or if it's not approved at all, then what happens? So this is something that we need Parliament to sit. I need answers from the health minister on this as soon as possible to get to that point of certainty. Um, then, I mean, the issue of delivery, I think the provinces are starting, like, they've figured this out, but again, they also need certainty on what type of vaccine they're delivering in order to give any sort of schedule on delivery. So this is why this information is so vital, and it's going to be continue to be a key focus of my parliamentary efforts. Just briefly on the other two things that I mentioned, uh, given that we don't have that information on vaccines, I think it's really critical that as a country we're employing techniques beyond lockdown. This is why since September I've been advocating for the government to review and actively court rapid testing technologies from around the world, not just in lab setting rapid tests, but also at home testing, so that workplaces and high congregation areas where people need to be can have an alternative to lockdown, so that we can more specifically test people that might be vulnerable, and then isolate accordingly. Examples would be elderly couples that are getting at-home caregivers. That these caregivers should have access to rapid tests, right? We shouldn't just be relying on lockdown. And there's a whole host of issues that I won't, I could spend an hour talking about related to that, but we're going to continue pushing on rapid testing so that we're not just looking at the blunt instruments of lockdowns. The last thing I mentioned, these other issues like variants. Today there was news reports that there was a variant that's emerged in Brazil. In fact, the United Kingdom has banned travel from a large swath of South American countries because this variant, there's concern that it's significantly different enough that it would reinfect people who already had antibodies, or who had already been infected with a primary strain of COVID, and may not be eligible or it may not react properly to the vaccine. So the question then arises, how is Canada detecting these variants? Do we have that capacity? And that's unclear. We're also trying to get information on that. Again, I would just summarize this by saying these are the types of questions that is incumbent upon politicians of all political stripe to answer in a transparent manner quickly so that we can have certainty to plan things like business or when your kids are going back to school or when we can see when we can have family reunification. I could speak at length about how this is affecting the airline industry, at length about borders as well. But this is the bottom line is that we need this information. It needs to be public so that I just think, Mark, we're at this point where a lot of people in Canada have not really gone through a crisis like this before. And like, I really almost feel like this is wartime, right? And we need a bigger, stronger plan than just the reactionary, uh, unpredictable measures that we've seen over the last year. And that'll be the focus of my efforts as Parliament resumes, hopefully in the next couple of weeks.
Michelle, let me ask you like a very politically sensitive question. You're a politician. We're sitting in Ontario and we just got another whack of lockdown restrictions, and everybody's trying to figure out what it all means. Uh, there's a public health bureaucracy, and then there's politicians. And we understand that politicians, we have really good politicians in Canada. I think it's fair to say, and they're responsible, but they're listening to public health officials. And the question is the balance between the rest of the economy and how lockdowns are affecting us. Directly for COVID, I mean, that's one shot thing, but it's making a lot of other problems. And do you think that politicians are balancing everything completely? Are they just listening to public health officials? Should they listen to public health officials, the absence of anything else? How do you think they should handle it?
Well, I don't believe at this juncture that any politician should be making populist decisions. Any decision that is made in this regard needs to be based on factual, quantitative data. I wrote an opinion piece about this in the National Post about 2 months ago about how Canada needs a different approach on COVID and one that's data driven. Um, we in Canada are as you all know, our healthcare systems are balkanized because we delivery is within provincial jurisdiction. So data sharing has been highly problematic. And as the vice chair of the Standing Committee on Health, getting basic information like how is this spreading, like what are the key drivers for spread, is difficult. And how can you measure whether or not a public health intervention is adequate or appropriate if we don't have basic information like that? I mean, that's a bit of an oversimplification. There is information that's available. There are epidemiologists that are, working overtime around on this issue, and I want to thank them for that effort. But I guess I would just say we now know enough about COVID, and we now know enough about the ancillary effects of lockdown that you alluded to. Like in Alberta, the suicide rate here has very much increased. Huge job losses. Um, Mental health. I think we haven't even started to talk about the mental health epidemic. So it is about, this is not a time for populism. It's a time for having tough conversations and being accountable for decisions that are directly impacting whether or not someone lives. And I don't think we're there yet. And I think that is not only the goal or the job of politicians like myself to just say, like, this is not an opportunity to get votes. This is an opportunity to do the right thing for the country. But it's also imperative on the Canadian public to be asking for this type of an approach in a pragmatic and sensitive way. And, that's something that I hope to contribute to, but just the lack of transparency, just to reemphasize that, it's leading to, I do think it's leading to populist decisions. It's leading to poor choices or lack of information to make choices with regard to business or mental health. And this is not something that the government can just ignore. So I think that the way forward on this is to get better data.
And this is four square within your parameters as being the health shadow minister. Canada had lots a certain amount of its resources to healthcare, and they did whatever they did back, beginning of 2020, and we are where we are. Do you think there's enough resources allocated? Are they being used wisely? And the fact that they're sort of split between provincial and federal, is there a better way to do it, especially to protect for the future?
Well, in the context of the question of pandemic management, I would say that the answer is squarely no. Um, I mean, we found out. I mean, living as as a member of parliament through the emergence of COVID and watching Canada's response to it is something. It'll probably take me years to unpack, but like we were making decisions. Our chief public health officer was saying that there was no uh, person-to-person transmission of COVID based on WHO data for some time once we knew it was spreading. Uh, why did that happen? And we found out, that the early warning system for the pandemic had been shuttered by the federal government, I think in 2018. So it begged the question, what sort of information were we using to determine the adequacy of our response? So to answer your question, like there are resources that we need. I would look at it as critical infrastructure as much as we would look at, highways or, rural broadband. We need to have these systems in place at a federal level. Then at a provincial, level, I think a lot of the lockdown um, measures that been put in place have been put in place because provincial governments are dealing with a reality that they really haven't been faced with before, which is ICU capacity during a pandemic. The capacity to treat people with heart attacks or aneurysms or car accidents, blunt force, like trauma accidents, if their ICU is filled with people who are suffering from the result of a pandemic. um I think that there's a lot, and then of course, we could spend a whole hour just talking about whether or not Canada's doctors, nurses, long-term care workers, etc., are adequately resourced, if there needs to be a better federal strategy. But I think, as a legislator, we have to start with, you have to triage, and the number one issue in this triage is, how are we getting a vaccine? Is the vaccine going to be the answer? And if not, then what's plan B? And this keeps me up at night, Mark, that I'm sitting on a call with you right now and not able to give you those answers. So there'll be a lot of unpacking of Canada's health system, our capacity to respond to incidences like this in coming years. But we've got to get through the fire right now. And I just think that the public can't accept the talking points that are coming out of both federal and to a certain extent provincial governments. I do think that there's better ways.
Okay, I think we have to change channels a bit just to allot our time wisely. And John's been listening patiently, but I think it's time, John, to weigh in on maybe some of the economic issues as they relate to some of the topics that we're talking about. So, John, you're at the forefront of Canadian real estate industry. You're, among all the ownership of KingSett. You're on the gamut of residential, commercial, industrial, and I'm sure other sectors. So, how do you think we're managing, and how do you think we're going to come out of it? And what can we look forward to in 2021? Are people going to change their work habits, their living habits? What are they going to do?
Well, Mark, first of all, thank you very much for having me on today, and it's a pleasure to join you. And Michelle, thank you for all your efforts on behalf of all Canadians on, what is a hugely important file. And the rest of us sleep at night when you don't. So thank you for your efforts. So I'm going to comment for a couple minutes on economic from a public policy perspective, and then talk about real estate specifically. So I think on the economic side, I have three things to say. The first is, with the massive stimulus that's gone into the system, and I'm not going to criticize anything decision that's been made to date, because decisions made in crisis are just that. The challenge will be, how do you unwind this stimulus without having a very nasty hangover? And while personal savings and so on are a key buffer, this is going to be a very tricky public policy issue that needs everybody's focus. The second issue is, Canada actually has a secret weapon in this war. And it's the war against climate change. And that's using our resource sector, because our resource sector, while there's been all this discussion about Canada's carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions, would it be possible for us to have a bolder vision, to use our excess bounty of resources to disintermediate coal around the world? I mean, we are seeing new coal plants in China, India, everywhere else. Is it possible that we could use our resources, which exist in every province, and export them to a world with our technology and our ESG technology and our financial wherewithal to actually have a goal to displace coal by say 2030? Much bigger idea. Third thing is, this is going to be a K recovery. And the difference between the up and the not so up is whether you have to leave your home to work or not, or whether you have to leave your home to operate your business or not. Because those that are suffering the most are those that have to leave their home to go to work, and their workplace is shuttered, and so they're out of work, and their employer may fold, and all those other issues that are related to that. And so this is going to be the efforts to help stabilize a recovery need to be, I think, carefully targeted to those that have been the most disadvantaged. As to real estate, my core thesis is most of us long for most of the aspects of life pre-COVID, and that post-COVID, and I define post-COVID as when we have herd immunity, either through vaccinations or through infections. But we'll get there. It's just a question of when. And so here's how I sort of see the different asset classes. In office, the same drivers for office exist today that existed before, which is community, connection, creativity, and productivity. Gathering in a physical space facilitates all of those elements. There's a reason you see big tech being the largest consumer of space in the US and Canada in new space over the last number of months, because they recognize the decline of productivity and creativity of their people working remotely. And I think, work from home will change, flex work. There'll be some other, changes. There's always evolution and some changes. But the core thesis, the people that say everybody will work from home and nobody will work from an office, those people better be careful what they wish for. Because it'll be those people, if you think you can work from home 100% of the time, then you're now competing for your services with people in Regina, with Bogota, in Mumbai. Anybody can do your job remotely. And that will have a really leveling impact. So I just don't see too much of that. So I think you saw it today in the paper. I posted on LinkedIn this morning, office vacancies gone from 3 to 7%. The article reads like that's a bad thing. For me, that's a bit of a win. That's not a big lift. So, but we're going to see office. I mean, obviously, if you can't use the product, you're not going to buy it. So we're going to see office vacancy, drift a little bit higher, but that's all right. On the other side of this, we'll get back at it. It'll stabilize the market and life will go on. This is volatility, not impairment. In industrial, it's going to see some interesting changes here because the whole supply chain dynamic is changed. It was just in case. And just in case, the efficiency model had been worked on for a generation. But just in case doesn't work in a crisis or an interruption. And it's going to be replaced with just in case instead of just in time. Sorry, I should have said just in time, apologize. Just in time is going to be replaced with just in case as all sorts of elements of the supply chain have to thicken because people demand that. In retail could actually be the sleeper because retail could outperform the apocalyptic expectations of many prognosticators. And, you know, the fact is that once we open the economy, once we get out again, what's the first thing many people will do? They'll go to a restaurant, a bar, or the mall. And because people want to get out, people want to see other people. We haven't fundamentally changed as human beings. In residential, the key is total immigration. Now, we know the Liberals have an ambitious immigration target of over 400,000 people a year. Once that starts and those gates open again, those 400,000 people, I mean, if you look at it, 40% typically come to Toronto. That's 160,000 people. That's, I don't know, 60 to 80,000 households. This will change aggressively because the slack in the system that you're seeing right now is very thin. And as immigration, as the economy resumes, opens up, and immigration resumes, I think you'll see that change dramatically. And hospitality, the food and beverage side of the business, I think will have a very, very sharp rebound, because once we are going to want to go out and have a drink with our friends, our loved ones, our relatives, our coworkers, the dog, anyone. And because, you know, we will want to get out from the basement. And as we do that, we'll find that there's fewer places to go that there was before. And those that are there will respond, I think, very quickly. Lastly, I'll just say on valuations, you know, there's been some valuation pressure on certain different asset classes, but I don't think we'll see that as a lasting impact. And sometimes valuators are focused on the rearview mirror. I'm looking out the front window. And what I see forward is once we get the jackboot of COVID off our necks, and whether that's in 3 months or 4 months or 2 months or 6 months, I don't know, but it's coming. Vaccines are coming, and shots and arms will get done. And we'll see that we will all want to get out and socialize and use those resources again. So I think we could actually see in the second half of 2021 a quite sharp recovery in many spots. So stay calm, carry on.
What do you see about interest rates, and particularly, it's intriguing to me, the changes in the U.S. Canadian dollar exchange rate?
So I think interest rates, you know, will be lower longer to an extent. Administrative rates will stay lower. The Bank of Canada, the Fed, et cetera, will err on keeping rates low to ensure they've got a growing economy. And now, as you've seen, the recent narratives changed from inflation targets to average inflation targets. And that's allowed them the leeway to have inflation overshoot their targets without raising rates. But it's the bond market to watch. Look at 30-year treasuries and 10-year Canadas. They will tell you the story. And as you've seen in Canada, 10-year Canadas have moved from kind of 55 basis points, 3 months ago or 2 months ago to sort of 80 today. 30-year treasuries, have gone from 60 and 70 basis points to over 1.1%. The private market is speaking. And the private market, being the long bond buyers, are saying that we are going to have a recovery, that inflation is coming, and they're moving those rates up. We'll see more of that.
What about the Canadian dollar exchange? There's been a pretty noticeable change in the last 6 months.
Yeah, I mean, it's highly impacted by commodity prices. I think the other thing we could see here is we are on the verge of what could be a commodity boom. You're seeing oil prices into the 50s, but it's not just that. It's everything from copper to lithium to every other sort of product you have. I mean, people think of electric vehicles like the energy comes from a socket in the wall and we're good to go. But the amount of stuff that needs to be extracted from the ground to create the same unit of energy for a car compared to oil is 5 times. So there's enormous pressure on commodities right across the system. And this is where Canada, and I just hope we can work out a national resource strategy, because we have sitting underneath our feet some, just riches that are phenomenal, and we could help the world in all sorts of ways.
Okay, but you're assuming that the Canadian dollar change, the US is really commodity driven. The US dollar is cheap against a lot of currencies. And I'm assuming, just what I read, that a lot of it has to do with how people are looking at the United States.
Yeah,
So,
I think let's assume the political trauma is not quite over, but will be over. Okay, I mean, there's going to be between now and Wednesday at 6 next week. There's going to be a lot of anxiety, and the best thing to do is to watch Netflix. But with that said, with that behind us, I think a lot of the political trauma will start to subside, and I think the dollar will stabilize. The U.S. dollar will stabilize, but clearly the Canadian dollar, the relationship between the Canadian dollar and oil is not coincidental. Right?
so I would actually ask both of you, Michelle and John, all the hullabaloo that's going on in the United States, and the future new administration, how's that going to change U.S.-Canadian relationships, and how's it going to change our lives?
Yeah,
Michelle?
I think I'm trying to be carefully word this. I I think we still have to keep an eye on U.S. politics for the same reason, in some ways, that we have to keep an eye on Canadian politics, in that there are pretty significant regional divisions in both of our countries that precipitate political unrest. And there's also significant class divisions that precipitate political unrest. And those divisions look a little different in our two countries, but I don't think that a transition of power necessarily is going to address those in and of itself. I think that it's incumbent upon legislators and political actors to realize that, and to be courageously addressing some of the causes for those divisions if we want a sustainable political economy, rather than just assuming that political flavor of the day is going to solve those problems. And that's what I worry. Like, I think John's right in that the inauguration will happen in the US, and things will move forward, but I don't think that that covers up some of the fissures that we've seen. And I'm a little bit sensitive to this. I'm an Alberta MP. My part of the country it hasn't had a particularly easy go of it over the last 4 years, and there's a lot of anger. And what I worry about is political actors that just use that anger to stoke political fortunes on the left and on the right, rather than doing the hard work and the heavy lifting of charting a course forward that any person of any background or any region can see themselves prospering in. And I think that that has to be the core of the answer to your question, Mark. I think between Canada and the US, if we can get that, if we can move beyond regional class divisions and start providing some economic hope for people, I think that lends some hope to a broader concern that I have, which is North America as an economic unit, and a unit that for the most part has shared values around democracy, rule of law, etc., really needs to start thinking about how we get our act together in the context of changes in, putting it mildly, some of the behavior of countries like China, Russia, etc. And also in the context of the fact that many Western economies are significantly overburdened from a debt perspective right now. And that's where I'm a little bit more bearish, John, on talking about currency and whether or not some of the changes that we've seen in the Canadian economy are largely rooted in commodity. I think that some of these issues in the political economy have led to some instability as well. And I also think that just in terms of Canadian American relations, there's also an issue of the fact that Canada is extremely behind other Western economies in terms of its share of intangibles as part of its forward-looking GDP prospect. So I guess I would just
Well,
say,
Jen,
Mark,
I
we
just told
have
you
to
to
get
stop
it
you there for
right.
1 minute.
Yeah,
Let me just stop you there. I apologize for, but I want to pick up on John's point about
yeah,
Canada's abundant resources. A lot of them are kind of like in more your neck of the woods than downtown Toronto. And to a large extent, you could only capitalize them if you get them to world markets. And as far as I understand it, some of that requires cooperation from the United States. And that's up and down in the last decade or so. Is
Can I,
that going to help? Are
yeah,
we better or worse off now?
can I just reframe this a little bit? Because, I mean, our issues are largely self-inflicted, right? If the resource strategy issue, which has, I'm an Albertan too, just full disclosure, which has a big impact in Alberta, Saskatchewan, also has a big impact in every single province, because whether it's hydro or nuclear energy or oil and gas or it doesn't matter what it is. Every province has a role here, and everybody would benefit. And the amount of economic activity we could unleash, while at the same time having a very focused climate strategy on how we would use our resources to disintermediate relatively dirty energy, could be a nation builder. So that's number one. Number two is, we have to have free trade. It is unimaginable that every province in the country has freer trade within the United States than it does with its neighbor. And it's a total lack of leadership in federal politicians over an extended period of time. It's both parties. And, it's disgraceful that we don't have free trade. We need to buy Canadian. We need to support our neighbors. And the third issue is we have to wake up to the fact that we've had a free ride on immigration over the last 4 years because we've been able to pick the best and the brightest because we had no competition. I got news for you. Starting Thursday, we got competition. And, we need to have our game on how we attract and continue to attract the best and the brightest. Because those three drivers, resource strategy, and interprovincial free trade, and attracting very bright immigrants, are fundamentally required for us to proceed and achieve anywhere near what our potential is for all Canadians in all provinces.
Okay, I'd like to switch it to the political arena for a moment, but before, to bridge both of these issues, could you tell me your thoughts about, on an international comparison, how Canada dealt with COVID relative to other, leading industrial nations? I mean, you could see what they did in Europe, Far East, Israel, and obviously the United States. How would you score Canada on the international scale?
I think it depends what metric framework you're using, right? I mean, you could use death per capita, you could use that metric combined with our economic prospects for recovery. You could look at vaccination schedules, but you also have to overlay that context, those metrics, with the fact that, a country that doesn't have the same tradition of civil liberties that Canada does has different tools, in terms of lockdown, what have you. I would just say that the fact that we're still relying on the blunt instrument of full economic lockdown a year into the pandemic, that we haven't really put thought to widespread use of technologies and best practices like rapid testing, and we don't have clarity on a delivery schedule for vaccines, is problematic. And I don't think that puts us on the top of the score sheet. But those are things that can be changed, if there's political will to do so. So in order to have that happen, there has to be an appetite from the public to change it. And so in that sense, I really do think it's up to the public to make that call.
John?
Well, I think A, it's too early to say. B, I agree with Michelle that there is an ongoing lack of transparency, and so decisions are being made that many of us are going, I'm not sure that makes sense to me, but whatever. That said, I do think we have to give our political leaders some latitude, because they're dealing with very difficult sets of facts. And I would laser focus on, we got to get needles in arms, and we can use the private sector to deliver it, pharmacies and drugstores. We can do lots of things. You notice in the United States, they've now opened it up and just said anybody over 65, because they found narrow targeting to be too difficult, and they couldn't quite fill the spots and so on and so forth. And I think you'll see a much rapid take up in the U.S. We have to move in that direction. Over 65, I don't know, whatever the number is. I'm kind of partial to over 65 personally, but and just get it going. And I think at the end of the day, how fast we get needles in arms will be how the government's judged.
I guess I would just build on that by saying, while I agree with it, a niggling concern I have in the back of my head is the vaccine a silver bullet? There was an exchange that the former transport minister had with the media last week around the announcement of the PCR testing requirement for pre-arrival into Canada from abroad, where he was asked point blank by the media, well, if somebody's vaccinated, do they still have to have this test? And he's like, well, yes, because the vaccine doesn't prevent you from catching it or spreading it. So I think that there's broader questions to be asked about the assumptions that leaders and public health officials are making about the ability of the vaccine to, like, at what point do we have herd immunity or at what point do people forecast that we don't have that potential draw on ICUs? That needs to be explored really quickly, because I think there's a lot of bullishness around the vaccine and saying, okay, well, we just need to get into arms. And then, we're seeing these variants, we're seeing stuff like that. And these are answers I don't have. But I think that they're questions that need to be answered pretty quickly.
The fact that you don't have these answers, of course, is disheartening, because of all people, you would have.
Quite.
Michelle, I invited you because we're hoping to get the answers.
I think it's pretty clear that, given a choice, a highly vaccinated population would be better than the opposite.
Absolutely, 100%.
We bought these vaccines. Let's get them in everybody's arms. As we go down the road, if I understand the process right, if you're vaccinated, it doesn't mean you necessarily won't get infected. It's just you won't get sick. And what we're trying to do is to avoid the pressure on the healthcare system and obviously people dying. So let's focus on one narrow agenda. Let's get vaccines. We bought them. We have 300 million apparently. Let's get them.
Not yet.
Well, you know what? And a guy like Rick Hillier in the province of Ontario couldn't be a better person to oversee this distribution. I just hope he's got the mandate to go get it done.
Well, he needs to have them first, right? And that's the issue. That's why I started off by saying, when are we getting these, and are we getting, are we just relying on? Well, I mean, that's what we're trying to find out. What was the procurement schedule that was negotiated? Why did the government take so long to sign contracts with some of these companies? Did they have to pay higher prices because we were negotiating with a Chinese company that was using a adenovirus-based platform on the front end? Like, these are questions we don't have. I mean, I don't think people listening to this actually care, because the bigger question is, when are we getting it? Right. And that's what I need to focus on. Everything else is will be litigated down the road. But I just want to say that, anybody who sits on a corporate board of directors, their job is to identify and mitigate risk, right? And at a senior level, I do think it's worth asking. We're banking on this vaccine, and I agree with you, John. Like, we need to have a vaccinated population on this, but we should be ensuring that we are mitigating any risks in terms of this potentially drawing on for a lot longer period. And then we need to start asking questions about ICU capacity and how do we bolster these other issues, therapeutics, et cetera, so that we're not in this situation in a year because we haven't identified potential risk and mitigated it.
Well, anecdotally, I don't have any privy information, but reading from the public press, and I'm very interested in Israel, as you could imagine, but Israel is probably up to 20% of their population. And a guy like Netanyahu is probably doing nothing but bugging the heck out of whoever it is to get vaccines. And he's at the airport every time a plane lands, and he's making a big deal about it. So they're amazingly proactive and ahead of the curve when it comes to vaccines. Could I pick up another point that John mentioned before? And I know, Michelle, even though right now you're in the the shadow minister of health, but I think you did have at one point function in the immigration side, and that also intrigues me personally because at Lanterra we sell condos, and immigration obviously helps that a lot. Do you see immigration patterns being as robust as we're hoping they are?
Well, I think what we can't take this sort of paternalistic view on immigration that we should just be utilizing immigration as a tool to quote pick the best and the brightest. I mean, Canada has always been a place where anybody from any background can come and make a go of it, and I don't think we should lose that principle. But John's point on immigration and talent in today's economy being a key determinant of economic growth is spot on. But I would argue that it's not just immigration policies or numbers. Well, that's important. It's also about ensuring that there are the environmental factors in place that you need to retain that talent. And I worry about talent retention in the current economic environment. I don't think that we're competitive when it comes to things like taxation rates or the ability to secure labor or even again, just to bring it up, like the intangible market, right? Like why do we license out most of Canada's top IP? Those are things that we need to be thinking about hand in glove when we are talking about immigration policy. And also things like the capacity for new Canadians to integrate. What are we doing as a society to ensure that there's access to language training services, that we're not ghettoizing certain communities or genders? These are broader questions that I've always felt that the focus has always been on numbers, which are important, but we also have to look at retention and integration as metrics. And that's where I'd like to see an equal amount of focus from a policy perspective put in this important file in years to come.
I think there's a risk that most Canadians are a little smug, thinking, well, this is the best place in the world to live. There's got to be a lineup. We'll pick and choose who we like, whatever. The fact is that this is going to be a competitive war to attract, high quality immigrants to the country, and we're competing against, the United States, the UK, and Australia, New Zealand, like it, and many other places. So we have to think through, to your point, Michelle, a whole suite of products on how to not just attract immigrants, but how to support them, how to give them the tools they need, the opportunities they need, the integration that they may desire, and all those other elements, because it's a fundamental tenet of part of our economic strategy going forward. And it needs more thought than just, if you open the door, they will come, because they may not. And it should be a great concern to everyone that we make sure we've got the whole system set up to welcome people and make sure that they are welcomed, and they tell their communities, both in Canada and from where they came, how welcome they were and how good the experience is.
Michelle, I'd just like to sort of touch on politics for a minute before fielding some questions and answers. And for the audience, and that there's hundreds of people listening to this, please post your questions and answer questions, and we'll try to, be able to field a few questions. But I listened avidly yesterday to your post about the recent federal cabinet shuffle, and whether that, leads to an election, what we expect politically. And, we have a new leader in the Conservative PC party, and how you intend to kind of meet the challenges of the political winds, in a sort of a COVID world, or an emerging out of COVID world.
Geez, I mean, like, election speculation right now has to be put in the context of public health. and safety. I mean, Quebec's under curfew. Ontario is essentially under curfew without calling it a curfew. Um, I and Alberta is in the same situation across the country. I think that legislators are across political stripe. Our focus has to be on navigating through this storm with regard to public health outcomes. We need to get a vaccine strategy. We need to um, put in place some certainty that Canadians see in terms of getting out of this. That's where my heart is. I think this transcends politics. I do think that the Liberal government is looking at the best window to go to an election. I really think that Trudeau wanted to go in September. um just it was post summer, lockdowns hadn't really started again, that we weren't in the second wave. That was his window to go. I know he wanted to go, but we were in the middle of the We Charity scandal, so they couldn't go. I think if the cynic in me says that if there is a window where it looks like he has a majority opportunity, he will go, he will take it, he will engineer defeat. I also think that a lot of this has to do with sort of non-obviously with the Bloc Québécois prospect in Quebec. If the Bloc are going to be picking up seats from Liberals in Quebec, I don't see how Trudeau gets a path to a majority government. And I think that more than the health, and this is the partisan me, more than the health and safety of Canadians, that would be a determining factor to a federal election. We need a budget. We haven't had a budget in almost 2 years federally. We need some clarity on the vaccines, putting it mildly. That's where, our focus is going to be. Hopefully that the House of Commons sits in a week and a half. And I just, I don't think Canadians particularly want an election right now.
Well, an election, when it comes, will probably be the report card on how the federal government handled COVID. And I guess Trudeau is going to have to face the electorate based on how he did that. How do you think he'll do? I know it's a partisan question, but
maybe John should answer that, because I think my answer will be a dead giveaway. So
I think
I was trying to lob you a softball.
the risk the existing government faces is that if vaccine rollout in Canada continues to trail the US, and if that trail accelerates, I think there'll be enormous pressure on the government to say what's wrong, because many of us have friends and acquaintances in the US who got vaccinated 2 weeks ago, and because I have old friends, right? The over 65 crowd, Canadians, over 65-year-old Canadians who've been vaccinated in the U.S. So I think these questions will really haunt this government, and it better get this vaccination program going and going to people's satisfaction. And I wouldn't touch an election until I was on the other side of that issue.
Yeah, no, I know there's a lot of sensitivity. Also, there are politicians who've had to resign because they travel internationally. On one side you have a closed border, but on the other hand, people are going wherever they want, and they're coming back, and you're our quarantine, not quarantine. It's a very, very uncertain. It's almost uneasy how uncertain that world is. I don't know if there's anything better you could do about it. It's almost rhetorical, but I would like to do one last question before of my own, and then field some questions. This is maybe kind of a bit academic, but we have a federal provincial split of who does what. So even in terms of dealing with COVID, like apparently it's the federal government who's buying vaccines. So Doug Ford says, well, when Trudeau gets me some vaccines, I'll get Hilliard to pass them around. There's things that are in the provincial jurisdiction, such as lockdowns, and then there's borders that are in the federal jurisdiction. Do you think the federal provincial split of jurisdictions and are working well under COVID, or we're just not doing a holistic, overall, work with it?
I just don't think we're in a situation where finger pointing across jurisdiction it has any sort of moral basis of good. I know
Well,
that
no,
it's
I'm not
happened to a
asking
certain
for finger
extent.
pointing.
No, no, no. I'm
I'm
getting.
wondering
I'm.
about the system of government, of
Uh,
how responsibilities are allocated.
Yeah, I mean, I
Does
think
that
that this
work
is
for
going to
COVID?
be that'll be a question that, to John's point, there's going to be a lot of time to go through what ifs and how can we do things better after this. But if there's any friction between the federal government and provinces in delivering of vaccines, it's going to be a highly charged political issue. But more importantly, we can't have it because it's our path forward. It's our path out of this. And I'm very aware that, the people that are in my riding, they don't care what level of government it is. They want a vaccine in their arm. And that's and they don't care what political stripe it is. They don't want people to be, saying, does this work or doesn't it work? They just want leadership. And, I saw, I think it was Dominic LeBlanc, one of the senior Liberal ministers, make this sort of comment like, well, the provinces have to deliver it. And the provinces are like, well, you have to get it to us. We have to break that logjam, which is why, one of the focuses that I'll be having, should Parliament return and the Prime Minister doesn't prorogue again, is to be asking just nonpartisan type questions on that vaccine delivery schedule.
Okay, I'm going to look at some of the questions, but the first question is really not a question. It's just intended to bring a smile to your face. It's from an anonymous attendee to Michelle. Can we count on the shadow minister to stand up in Parliament, speak to the government on behalf of Canadians, and demand immediate action on vaccinations? I did not plant that.
The
But
answer
I
is
think
yes.
if you listen, if you follow Michelle's
That's all I do.
that's all she does. That's right. So John, would you, if you had $100 million to spend, would you buy another office building? That's a question.
Yeah, I think, I would, let me reframe it. Would you buy real estate, commercial real estate, period? And the answer to that question is yes. And I think, and I would buy office, I would buy retail, I would buy, industrial. I think but it's all situational, as you well know. I mean, you are a famed and very skilled investor. It's about, the specifics of the individual opportunity. And I think today you've got heightened risk, in a number of different sectors, and you have to think that through, what that means. But again, it's my core view that we will be back to a more normal environment, and it will take some time. And we've spent a lot of time in this webinar talking about the political issues that has extended perhaps that time frame. That said, we all know what's coming, which is we all will in due course have a vaccine, and we'll be back at it. And I think back in offices. And if it's a well located, well thought through office project, yes, I would invest in office.
So I also noticed, and this is our business, Lanterra, we do condominiums downtown, and I did notice some of your posts that you presented some very exciting and very beautiful forward-looking condominium projects. They're a bit tied together, condominium residential downtown Toronto. If there's nobody working or studying downtown, there is a bit of a glut in rents in downtown Toronto. How do you see that changing over the course of 2021?
Well, I think it'll revert, and you could very well have a shortage. Look, we're going to get. I think this is going to rebound relatively quickly. In other words, once the economy is open, once we're allowed and feel comfortable, circulating, walking around, we will do just that. I live in an apartment in downtown Toronto. Every time I walk around, I get energy. I love it. And, for me, I could never live in a remote, smaller community. Might be fine to vacation there, but I'd lose my mind. And if the energy of that downtown city, which is phenomenal, will be back, and all the things that drove it will be back. The youth, the energy, the jobs, the entertainment, the bars, the scene, it's like, I think that will all be back, because there's very few of us that envision, well, I can spend the rest of my life in my basement and consume on Amazon, food on Instacart, and and work remotely. I mean, you know, there are some, but not many.
Okay, this is my own question. Okay, I'll be honest. If you had an extra $100,000 to spend and you want to put a deposit down on a downtown condo, and we would give you a friends and family discount, really. When along 2021 would you think that would be the time to invest?
I'd give you that money today.
Okay, I'm seeing my like question and answer chat period like lighting up for that.
Well, and I say that because, you know, again, it's my core thesis. You're probably selling to me today at an attractive price. You may be taking advantage of me, I never know. But let's assume it's at what I think is an attractive price. And I think that you will see core residential values continue to do well. We're having a little short term, you know, a rental pause, like whatever. Like that's not that, you know, that's barely noise as far as I'm concerned. Think of the core fundamentals. Nothing's changed. We will
Well,
resume immigration. We will have to find a place for people to live. There will be increased demand in the center of our core cities.
so that's great. And the big piece of that puzzle, and you're at the forefront of this, and to a certain extent, obviously, is part of our business. If let's say throw a number, an average condo downtown Toronto was at $1,200 in the beginning of 2020, and we're coming now into 2021, and the cost pressures, if anything, are higher. You know, the question is how much will a commodity 500 or 600 square foot condo uh, end up, like how far could it go? You know, given the fact that there, you know, the profit and margin pressures are kind of not as good as they used to be because of that. There's just a limit to what people could spend.
Right.
And
So
there's a limit to how small you can make condos.
I know. That's why I'm interested in buying, because you're not going to build any new ones. And all that means is in 2 or 3 years, it's going to be a steeper spike.
Okay, well, let me ask you this. If in the beginning of 2020, and you were looking at end price, so you buy a 1 bedroom, because of COVID, would you buy a 1 bedroom plus 10, just in case you need to work there sometimes and spend that
You know
extra
what?
50,000 bucks?
I think we will see more demand for larger units. And when you've got money effectively free, right, with interest rates, residential interest rates at a 1 point something or other, you know, I think you've changed the affordability paradigm. So I would look to slightly larger unit. I would lean to a 2 bedroom or a 1 plus a den or something slightly larger, because I think that's going to have a higher demand.
Okay, well, that's like, well, we're really looking forward to that world. Michelle, I got to tell, I can't thank you enough for joining us today. I follow you avidly, and to all of our guests today, I strongly recommend you sign up to both John and Michelle's posting. It's very informative, and for whoever it was who asked whether Michelle would stand up for Canadians, that's all she does. And I must tell you, just as a personal comment, I have the utmost respect. You are now the health minister, but you've had different portfolios, both as when the Conservatives were the governor and in opposition, and you've brought your very enormous talents to whatever portfolio you were serving. And you know, I think you've served under 3 different leaders over the last couple of years, and you've always
4
been
actually, but
4. Wow,
oh,
that's been great, and obviously, you know, your defense of the interests of your constituents in Western Canada, and that's very important. So it was great having you. We are going to be posting this webinar on our YouTube channel, and we'll be making it available to whoever would be interested to watch it after the program. Again, thank you very much. It was great and a great honor, and have a great weekend coming up.
thank you.
Thank you for having us.